The Professor's Heart by Audrey Sinclair. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the small town of Silver Springs. Margaret Foster stood on the wooden porch of her father's general store, watching as the last stagecoach of the day rolled in, kicking up a cloud that settled over Main Street. A cooling breeze swept through, carrying the scent of sage and promise, a welcome respite from the sweltering July heat. At 24, Margaret had long since resigned herself to spinsterhood, not that it bothered her much. She'd seen enough unhappy marriages to last a lifetime. Her father's shop provided all the satisfaction she needed, along with the occasional excitement of new merchandise shipments and the stories brought in by travelers passing through. "Maggie," her father called from inside, "those new ledgers won't balance themselves." She sighed, tucking a loose strand of chestnut hair behind her ear. "Coming, Pa." Just as she turned to go inside, the stagecoach door swung open. A tall man stepped out, his broad shoulders briefly silhouetted against the setting sun. Even from this distance, Margaret could see he carried himself differently from the cowboys and miners who typically passed through Silver Springs. There was an elegance to his movements, despite the trail dust coating his dark coat. Their eyes met across the street. For one breathless moment, Margaret felt as though the world had narrowed to just this man and herself. Then he tipped his hat in a courteous greeting, and the spell broke. Margaret hurried inside, her cheeks flushed. "Who's that?" she asked her father, moving to the window for another glimpse. Samuel Foster barely looked up from his accounting books. "New fellow. Came in on the Denver stage. Heard he's taking over old Doc Hamilton's ranch now that he's passed." "A rancher?" Margaret couldn't hide her surprise. The stranger's refined bearing suggested otherwise. "Not just any rancher," Samuel said, finally glancing up. "Word is he's some fancy educated type from back east. Philadelphia, I think. Name's Thornfield, Daniel Thornfield." Daniel Thornfield had not planned to settle in the West. Life had been predictable in Philadelphia, comfortable even. He'd been a respected professor at the university, with a modest inheritance and a quiet life surrounded by books and academic colleagues. Then came his uncle's letter, and everything changed. "You've inherited Raven Creek Ranch," the lawyer had informed him, peering over wire-rimmed spectacles. "Your Uncle Hamilton left it to you, being his only living relative." Daniel had never met his mother's brother, a man who had apparently abandoned civilization for the frontier decades ago. He'd intended to sell the property sight unseen, but something, perhaps the same restlessness that had plagued him since Sarah's death 3 years prior, compelled him to see this wild country first. Now, as he stood on the dusty main street of Silver Springs, Daniel questioned his decision. The journey had been grueling, the accommodations primitive. He'd spent the past week on jolting stagecoaches, surrounded by rough men who eyed his tailored clothing with suspicion. Yet there had been that moment, that curious, unexplainable moment when he'd stepped off the coach and seen her. A woman standing on a porch, her simple dress moving gently in the breeze, her face a study in quiet dignity. Their eyes had met, and for the first time since leaving Philadelphia, Daniel felt a flicker of interest in something beyond his grief. The hotel proved adequate, if basic. After washing away the grime of travel, Daniel made his way to the town's only restaurant, a modest establishment attached to the saloon. He had just been served a surprisingly decent bowl of stew when the door opened, admitting the woman from the general store, accompanied by an older man he presumed to be her father. They were seated at a table near his own. Up close, he could see that she was older than he'd first thought. A woman, not a girl. Her features were strong rather than delicate, with intelligent eyes that took in her surroundings with quiet assessment. When those eyes landed on him, Daniel found himself sitting straighter. "Mr. Thornfield," the older man called, nodding in greeting. "Samuel Foster. I run the general store. This is my daughter, Margaret." Daniel rose and approached their table. "A pleasure to meet you both. I'm afraid you have the advantage of me, you know who I am, while I've only just arrived." Samuel Foster chuckled. "Small towns, Mr. Thornfield. News travels faster than the telegraph here." "Please join us," Margaret offered, her voice lower and richer than Daniel had expected. "We'd be happy to tell you about Silver Springs." Daniel hesitated only briefly before accepting. As he settled into their conversation, he felt an unfamiliar sensation. The tight band of loneliness that had constricted his chest for years seemed to loosen just slightly. Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret found herself looking forward to Daniel Thornfield's visits to the store with an eagerness that both thrilled and unsettled her. He came regularly, ostensibly to purchase supplies for Raven Creek Ranch, though his purchases were often small and unnecessary. "Surely you don't need another box of nails so soon," she teased one afternoon as she wrapped his purchase. "Perhaps not," he admitted with a small smile that transformed his serious face. "But I find I require the conversation more than the merchandise." Margaret felt her cheeks warm. "And how are you finding ranch life, Professor? Different from university halls, I imagine." "Vastly." He leaned against the counter. "The foreman, Mr. Jenkins, barely conceals his amusement at my ignorance. I believe he and the ranch hands have a wager on how long I'll last before returning east." "And will you?" Margaret asked, suddenly concerned. "Return east, I mean." Daniel studied her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I haven't decided. The ranch is challenging, but I find myself increasingly drawn to certain aspects of life here." Later that evening, as Margaret helped her father close the store, Samuel Foster cleared his throat meaningfully. "That professor's become a regular customer." Margaret busied herself with straightening already neat shelves. "He's just being friendly, Pa. He's new here and doesn't know many people." Her father's tone was knowing. "Just be careful, Maggie. Men like that, educated from wealthy families, they don't usually settle in places like Silver Springs. And if they do, they don't usually stay." "I know that," she said sharply, then softened her tone. "I'm not some foolish girl with stars in her eyes. We're just friends." But that night, lying in bed, Margaret admitted to herself that friends didn't adequately describe what she felt when Daniel entered the store, when his deep voice said her name, when their fingers briefly touched as she handed him his purchases. It was a dangerous feeling, one she had deliberately avoided for years. Men had expressed interest before, but she'd held them at a distance, unwilling to risk her independence for the uncertain promises of love. Daniel Thornfield, however, slipped past her defenses with unsettling ease. The invitation came on a Tuesday, delivered by one of the ranch hands. Daniel was hosting a small dinner at Raven Creek Ranch and requested Margaret and her father's company. Samuel declined, citing bookkeeping duties, but insisted Margaret should go. "Mrs. Jenkins will be there," he pointed out, referring to the foreman's wife. "It's perfectly proper." And so Margaret found herself being driven to the ranch in Daniel's buggy, acutely aware of his presence beside her, of the narrow seat that forced their shoulders to touch with each bump in the road. "I should warn you," Daniel said as they approached the ranch house, "the place is rather sparse. I haven't had time to make it particularly homey." Sparse was generous. The main house, while solidly built, contained only the most basic furniture. Yet Margaret could see potential in the high-ceilinged rooms and large windows that offered stunning views of the surrounding landscape. "It needs a woman's touch," Mrs. Jenkins declared bluntly as she served their dinner. "But the professor here seems more interested in his books than in finding a wife." Daniel's embarrassed expression made Margaret smile. The dinner was simple but good, and conversation flowed easily. After they ate, Daniel showed Margaret his small library, books transported at considerable expense from Philadelphia. "Most people would have brought more furniture and fewer books," Margaret observed, running her fingers along the leather spines. "Most people have different priorities," Daniel replied. Standing among his beloved books, he seemed more relaxed than she'd ever seen him. "Do you read, Miss Foster?" "When I can. Pop brings me novels from Denver sometimes." She pulled a volume of poetry from the shelf. "Keats? I wouldn't have guessed you for a romantic poet enthusiast." "There's a great deal we don't yet know about each other," he said softly. Margaret looked up to find him watching her, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken possibilities. The moment was broken by Mrs. Jenkins announcing that the sky threatened rain, and they should start back to town if they wanted to avoid a downpour. On the ride back, raindrops began to fall, fat and heavy. By the time they reached town, the skies had opened completely. Daniel urged the horses to the shelter of the general store's covered porch, then helped Margaret down from the buggy. "You're soaked," she laughed, noticing how his dark hair curled in the dampness. "As are you." His voice was fond as he reached out to brush a raindrop from her cheek. The touch was fleeting, but it sent warmth spreading through Margaret despite her wet clothes. They stood close, the rain creating a curtain around them, a private world where only they existed. "Margaret," Daniel began, his voice barely audible above the drumming rain. Yes, she whispered. Instead of speaking, he leaned forward slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away. Margaret remained still, her heart racing as his lips met hers in a kiss as gentle as it was brief. When he pulled back, his eyes searched hers, uncertain. "I should go in," Margaret said, though she made no move to do so. Daniel nodded. "Of course. Good night, Margaret." "Good night, Professor," she replied, a small smile playing at her lips before she turned and entered the store. Inside, she leaned against the closed door, touching her fingers to her lips, remembering the warmth of his. The weeks that followed settled into a pattern. Daniel divided his time between learning ranch management and visiting town, visits that increasingly centered around the general store and its keeper's daughter. They were careful to maintain propriety. Daniel never called without Samuel's knowledge, and they were never truly alone. But the town noticed. Whispers followed Margaret through church socials and market days. "Never thought I'd see Maggie Foster sweet on anyone," she overheard Miss Caldwell tell the seamstress, let alone that Eastern professor playing at being a rancher. The words stung, partly because they echoed her own fears. Was Daniel merely playing at ranch life? Would he tire of the constant challenges and return to Philadelphia? And what of her? Margaret had built a life of quiet independence. Was she willing to risk that for a man who might not stay? These questions haunted her one August afternoon as she organized new inventory. The bell above the door jingled, and she looked up to find Daniel standing there, his expression unusually serious. "I need to speak with you," he said without preamble. "Is your father available as well?" Margaret's stomach tightened with apprehension. "He's in the back office. Is something wrong?" "Not wrong, no, but important." Samuel emerged from the back room, and Daniel addressed them both. "I've received a letter from the university. They've offered me my position back with a promotion to department chair." Margaret felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath her feet. Here it was, the moment she had feared. She struggled to keep her expression neutral as Daniel continued. "They want an answer within the month." He looked directly at Margaret. "I wanted to discuss it with you before making any decision." Samuel glanced between them, then tactfully announced he needed to check on something in the storeroom, leaving them alone in the front of the shop. "You should take it," Margaret said once her father had gone, her voice steadier than she felt. "It's a prestigious position. You'd be foolish to turn it down for," she gestured vaguely at their surroundings. "For what, Margaret?" Daniel pressed, moving closer. "For this town. For the ranch?" His voice softened. "For you?" Margaret turned away, busying herself with organizing items that needed no organizing. "We've known each other barely 2 months, Daniel. That's hardly a foundation on which to base life-altering decisions. Some people know in less time." He gently turned her to face him. "I came here expecting nothing, seeking nothing but a brief glimpse of my uncle's life before selling his property and returning to mine. Instead, I found something I never expected." "And what was that?" Margaret asked, barely trusting herself to speak. "A second chance." Daniel's eyes held hers. "After Sarah died, I thought that part of my life was over. I threw myself into my work, into books and theories, things that couldn't hurt me because they demanded nothing of my heart. Then I met you." Margaret's defenses wavered at the raw honesty in his voice. "Daniel. I love you, Margaret Foster." The words, spoken plainly and without embellishment, hung in the air between them. "I know it's sudden. I know we come from different worlds. But I believe, I hope, that you might feel something for me as well." Margaret closed her eyes, feeling tears threatening. "I do," she admitted. "But that doesn't change anything. You belong in Philadelphia with your books and your university." "I belong where I choose to be," he countered. "And I'm asking you to help me make that choice." He took her hand. "Come with me to Philadelphia as my wife." The proposal, so unexpected, left Margaret speechless. "Or," Daniel continued when she didn't respond, "if you prefer, I'll stay here. I'll decline the university's offer and commit myself fully to Raven Creek Ranch, to Silver Springs, to you." Margaret pulled her hand away. "I can't let you do that. You'd resent me eventually, giving up everything you've worked for." "Then come with me," he urged. "Philadelphia isn't as different as you might think. You're intelligent, adaptable." "I'm a shopkeeper's daughter from a mining town," Margaret interrupted. "I've never even been to Denver, let alone an eastern city. I'd embarrass you among your colleagues and friends." Hurt flashed across Daniel's face. Is that what you think of me? That I'd be ashamed of you?" Before Margaret could answer, the shop bell rang again, admitting Mrs. Caldwell and her daughter. Daniel stepped back, his expression closing. "Think about what I've said," he told her quietly. "I need to return to the ranch, but I'll call again tomorrow." With a nod to the new customers, he left, the bell jangling in his wake. That night, Margaret barely slept. Daniel's proposal tumbled through her mind alongside her own fears and doubts. By morning, she was no closer to an answer. The following day passed with excruciating slowness. Every time the shop bell rang, Margaret looked up expecting to see Daniel, but he never appeared. By closing time, a knot of worry had formed in her stomach. "Perhaps he's busy at the ranch," Samuel suggested, noticing her distraction. "Ranch work doesn't always allow for social calls." Margaret nodded, though something felt wrong. Daniel had said he would come today. He was a man of his word. Her worries deepened the next day when one of the ranch hands came to the store, not with a message from Daniel but to purchase supplies. When questioned, he mentioned that the professor had ridden out early the previous morning to check the north pasture boundary and hadn't returned. "Jenkins figured he probably stayed at the line cabin up there," the man said with a shrug. "It's a far piece back, and there was talk of storms." By evening, with still no word from Daniel, Margaret could no longer contain her concern. She approached her father as he locked up the store. "Pa, I need to borrow the wagon." Samuel looked up sharply. "What for?" "I'm worried about Daniel. It's not like him to say he'll come and then not appear, message or no." "Now, Maggie. Please, Pa. If he's angry about how we left things, I need to know. And if something's happened," she couldn't finish the thought. Samuel studied his daughter's face, then sighed. "I'll drive you. But if he's fine, and just busy, you'll owe me a month of inventory duty." They set out for Raven Creek Ranch as dusk was falling. The foreman met them in the yard, his expression grim. "Professor still hasn't returned," he confirmed. "Sent 2 men out looking earlier today. They came back saying there was no sign of him at the line cabin, but they found his horse wandering near Cougar Ridge with a broken bridle." Margaret felt her blood turn cold. "And Daniel?" Jenkins shook his head. "No sign. We're organizing a proper search party at first light. That's rough country up there, lots of ravines, loose rocks. Easy for a man to get injured, especially one not used to the terrain." "I'm joining the search," Margaret declared, ignoring her father's protest. "No place for a woman," Jenkins stated flatly. "I know that area as well as any of your men," Margaret countered. "I used to ride up there with my brother before he moved to California." Her voice softened. "Please, I need to help." Something in her expression must have reached the gruff foreman, for he eventually nodded. "Be here before sunrise. Wear sturdy boots and bring water." The night passed in agonizing slowness. Margaret prayed as she had never prayed before, bargaining with God for Daniel's safety. By the time she and her father returned to the ranch in the pre-dawn darkness, a group of men with lanterns had already gathered in the yard. Jenkins divided them into search parties, assigning each group a section of the North Range to cover. Margaret found herself riding alongside a ranch hand named Taurus, a quiet man who knew the terrain intimately. They searched throughout the morning, calling Daniel's name, scanning the ground for any sign of his passage. The August sun beat down mercilessly as they picked their way through rocky ravines and steep slopes. It was Taurus who spotted it first. A flash of something not natural to the landscape, tucked in the shadow of a rock outcropping. Margaret urged her horse forward, her heart pounding. Daniel lay unconscious, his body wedged between 2 boulders, one leg bent at an unnatural angle. A gash on his forehead had crusted with dried blood. "Daniel?" Margaret was off her horse in an instant, scrambling over the rocks to reach him. His skin burned with fever when she touched his face. "Daniel, can you hear me?" His eyelids fluttered but didn't open. Taurus fired his revolver 3 times into the air, the agreed-upon signal that they'd found something. "He's alive," Taurus confirmed after checking, "but that leg is broken bad, and he's been out here at least a day and a night." The wait for the others to reach them was excruciating. Margaret cradled Daniel's head in her lap, talking to him continuously, wiping his brow with her dampened handkerchief, praying for him to open his eyes. When he finally did, his gaze was unfocused. "Margaret?" he murmured, then winced in pain. "Don't move," she urged, tears of relief streaming down her face. "Help is coming." "The horse spooked," he explained, his voice barely audible. Something in the brush I was thrown tried to walk back. "Shh," Margaret soothed. "Save your strength." His fevered eyes locked onto hers with surprising clarity. "I thought I might die out here," he whispered. "All I could think was that I never got to hear your answer." Margaret's tears fell faster. "My answer is yes," she told him. "Yes to you, yes to us, whether that's here or in Philadelphia or anywhere else." A ghost of a smile touched his cracked lips before his eyes closed again. The doctor from the next town overset Daniel's leg and treated his other injuries. The fever, he warned, was the greatest danger. Daniel had developed an infection from his untreated wounds. For 3 days and nights, Margaret rarely left his bedside in the ranch house. She bathed his fevered skin with cool cloths, spooned broth between his lips when he was lucid enough to swallow, and read aloud from his beloved books when he was restless. On the 4th night, his fever broke. Margaret, dozing in a chair beside his bed, awoke to find him watching her, his eyes clear for the first time since they'd found him. "You're still here," he said, his voice weak but steady. "Where else would I be?" She moved to sit on the edge of the bed, taking his hand in hers. "I thought perhaps I had dreamed it, your answer." Daniel's fingers tightened around hers. "Did you mean it?" "Every word." Margaret leaned forward to press a gentle kiss to his forehead. "Though I should warn you, I'm still not entirely sure which option I'm saying yes to." Daniel laughed softly, then winced at the pain it caused. "We have time to decide that. Together." As the days passed and Daniel's strength returned, they talked of possibilities. Philadelphia offered culture, education, opportunities Margaret had never dreamed of experiencing. Silver Springs offered familiarity, community, and the challenge of building something new from Raven Creek Ranch. "We could do both," Daniel suggested one evening as they sat on the ranch house porch watching the sunset. "Winters in Philadelphia during the university term, summers here at the ranch." Margaret considered the idea. A foot in each world, she mused. It might work, at least for a time. "And which world would we marry in?" Daniel asked, his tone light though the question was significant. Margaret smiled. "This one. If you're determined to make me a professor's wife, I at least want to start as a rancher's wife." Their wedding took place in Silver Spring's small church that October. Margaret wore a simple dress of ivory silk, ordered specially from Denver. Daniel stood tall and proud beside her, his limp barely noticeable now. As they exchanged vows before friends, neighbors, and a few of Daniel's university colleagues who had made the journey west, Margaret felt a certainty she had never known before. Loving Daniel meant embracing uncertainty, divided lives, different worlds, challenges they couldn't yet imagine. But looking into his eyes as he promised himself to her, she knew that whatever path they chose, they would walk it together. "I love you," he whispered, as they turned to face their guests as husband and wife. "And I you," she replied, stepping with him into their shared future, a future neither of them could have predicted, but both now embraced. The last light of the day streamed through the church windows, illuminating their joined hands, the scholar and the shopkeeper's daughter, the Easterner and the frontier woman, two people who had found in each other what they hadn't known they were seeking: completion.